Support for this and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
Hello? Guten Tag? Bonjour? Halang wa salam? Hola? How y'all? Yobaseo? Just checking the mics one last time here. Good afternoon. My name is John Nicholas. Thank you for coming out to the 12th or 13th winter lecture this year. Somebody asked me earlier in the week if these programs are being filmed. They are not. I talked to Jason Martz a couple weeks ago, and we just don't have the money to do it. We don't have the personnel or the money to do it this year. Maybe next year, but right now we just can't do it. But I'd like to thank you for coming out this afternoon. Before he retired from the United States Army, General Colin Powell did a class on leadership. And during his presentation, he put up this slide right here for what he calls his 40-70 rule. 40-70 being the amount of information you need to make a decision. 40% being the minimum amount, 70% being the maximum amount. General Powell understands that the decision is a puzzle, and the puzzle's pieces are information. With only a few pieces, you can't figure out what the puzzle looks like. But you don't necessarily need every piece to see the big picture. Your puzzle is also time sensitive. You need to see the big picture today, not tomorrow. Tomorrow, when you have more or all the pieces, it may be too late because the picture has already changed. Much of Robert E. Lee's success in 1862 and 1863 were due in large part because Lee got enough pieces of the puzzle fast enough to see the big picture. So why did Lee's army fail at Gettysburg? The answer lies in a little-known information war that was fought between the two armies between May 28th and July 2nd, 1863. Before I go any further, I need to find two words, information and intelligence. During the Civil War, the two words are used interchangeably, but they're eventually going to mean two different things, and they're going to be meaning two different things due to this particular campaign, the Gettysburg campaign. And so I want to define those words right now. Information is a piece of the puzzle. It stands alone by itself. It may be true, but by itself, it might not seem important. It might be false, or fake news, as the kids call it today. You can receive a lot of information and not get any intelligence. So intelligence by itself is just a little piece, or information is just that. It's just information, may be good, may be bad. Intelligence is information that has been processed. That one piece of information is check the reliability of the source. Is it a rumor or something more concrete like an eyewitness or a captured document? The information is then matched with other pieces of information to verify whether or not it's true or false. The information is then combined with other pieces of information which start to reveal part of the picture. At last, several parts of the picture are combined and then distilled into a report to provide the big picture of the enemy. Now, it's never going to be a great picture because you're never going to get all the pieces. One of the pieces is uncertainty and chance. But at least for now, it's a good picture. Now, it's actually intelligence. From there, it's forwarded to the person that makes the decisions. The final step of the process is the decision maker has to decide what to do with that intelligence and whether to act on it or not. So what were the sources of information during the Civil War, and how did the two armies get that information? One of the first sources is captured documents from the enemy. And you're looking at a captured document right here. And if you'll notice the date, the captured document was written on June 22nd, or June 28th, rather, 1863. It would be captured on July 2nd, 1863, and that'll be important at the end of the program. Captured documents can reveal a lot about the enemy, but it's only good for a certain amount of time. And there may not be enough information in the document. There may be too much information in the document. If the enemy knows the document has been captured, they can change their plans, but that will take time. If they don't know the document has been captured, it can lead to disaster. Another source of information is the mail. A lot of times documents are traveled with the mail. Soldiers are riding home. There's no censorship during the Civil War, and Ma and Pa back home want to know what's happening in the Army. And so a lot of soldiers will write home about what they're doing, where they are, and where they're going, what the plans are. So the enemy is interested in your mail as well if you're a soldier. There's also newspapers. The newspaper reporters are the people back home who want to read about the boys in the blue or gray. And they have no problems putting this stuff in the newspapers. Both sides read the enemy's newspapers. Robert E. Lee was a big reader of northern newspapers. We'll get a great deal of information from those newspapers. Then you have spies. The person on the left, Belle Boyd, she's famous. She's a terrible spy. Belle Boyd was famous the early part of the war. Rode with Stonewall Jackson, providing him a little bit of information, and she would write about her accounts, would become an actress after the war, touring, talking about her exploits, which were basically useless to the other side. Elizabeth Van Lew, though, she was a wealthy woman who lived in Richmond, and she's one of the unknown heroes of the Civil War. She was an abolitionist even prior to the start of the Civil War. She ran a huge spy network, which eventually the Union Army is going to make use of. She would help prisoners escape from Libby Prison in Richmond. At one point, she had a spy in the Confederate White House. And the Confederacy has spies as well in Washington. Actually, two of them work in the War Department. The Confederacy ran a spy network called the Secret Line. And unfortunately, a lot of the Secret Line's documents were destroyed at the end of the war, and the man who ran the Secret Line, who's also the chief signal officer, Confederate Army, Walter Norris, unfortunately, whatever documents he kept were burned in a house fire in 1904. So we don't know a lot about the Secret Line, but we do know they were providing information to the Confederate Army. They had spies running from Richmond to Fredericksburg to the northern neck in Virginia between the Potomac and Rappahannock River, and Washington, Baltimore, New York City, all the way up until to Canada. But spies, some of them could turn in a great deal of information. Others, like Belle Boyd, were just celebrities and kind of useless to both sides. Then you have private detective agencies. There were two of them that served the East. One was run by Lafayette Baker, who had formed a vigilante committee out in San Francisco, came east and was first employed by Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the United States Army at the start of the Civil War, then by Secretary of State Seward, and then finally by the War Department. Lafayette Baker would claim the rank of colonel, actually get photograph taken in a Union Army uniform. He had no rank whatsoever. His detectives were useless. Actually, they amounted to a little more than secret police. The other detective agency was the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons had existed before the war. This is Alan Pinkerton, oops, right there, sitting down with the cigar right there. Pinkerton was a good detective, and his guys were honest, but the problem was they were inept at collecting military intelligence. It was too slow coming in, and often it was wrong. And they worked directly for George McClellan, the commander of the Union Army at the start of the Civil War. When McClellan was fired by Lincoln in 1862, Alan Pinkerton left with him. But most of the information that Pinkerton provided to the Union Army was close to useless. And his agents were close to useless, except for this guy right here, John Babcock, who you're going to hear about a little bit later. So, detective agencies are useless. Most information coming into the Army is coming from prisoners and deserters. Prisoners were an excellent source of information because they're coming straight from the Army. Deserters want to get out of the Army, and they're happy to give you whatever information is useful to you to bring this war to an end. And the Union Army Colonel George Sharp will start a program for deserters that if you give us information that turns out to be good, we'll find you a job in the North, and you can move into the North. And a lot of these guys in the Army, young men, and start a new life in the North. A lot of them will. The deserters were always willing to talk. Then you have civilians. Sometimes could provide great information, like Elizabeth Van Lew. Sometimes not. Refugees often exaggerated what they knew just because they were scared and didn't know any better. A massive source of information for the Union Army during the Civil War are going to come from runaway slaves or contrabands, who provide a great deal of information to the Union Army. And Southerners treated their slaves like furniture, would basically say anything around them, not realizing their slaves were listening to everything they said and passing it on to the Union Army. A big source for collecting information is from Union signal detachments and Confederate signal detachments, who are in high places and can see for long distances. They're not only used for sending information, they're used for watching the enemy, and they'll provide a great deal of information throughout the war. But the biggest collector of information is cavalry, the horse soldiers of the Army. An Army's cavalry had the primary mission of collecting information by watching the enemy and capturing prisoners for interrogation. Cavalry also had a counterintelligence role, which they were supposed to prevent the enemy from seeing what their own army was doing. The Confederate Army understood this from the very beginning of the Civil War, and Jeb Stuart and his horse soldiers did a fantastic job and provided Lee with much information. As I said, much of Lee's success in the first 2 years of the war was due to the fact that Stuart was bringing them excellent information from mounted patrols and from scouts operating in front of and behind the Union lines. The Union Army failed to understand the role, the importance of cavalry reconnaissance during the first 2 years of the war. Their horse soldiers were deployed in single regiments and used as pickets, wagon train guards, and couriers, just about everything but finding out what the enemy was up to. The best, absolute best source of information for the Army, though, came from the Army scouts. That's not a scout right there. There we go. Right there. Scouts were, for the most part, were actually soldiers in their armies that were good at collecting information, sometimes wearing their own uniform, sometimes wearing the enemy's uniform, sometimes disguised as civilians. They would often infiltrate the enemy's camps while they were in camp or while they were on the march. There was one scout, Sergeant Milton Klein from the 3rd Indiana Cavalry, who just prior to the start of the Chancellorsville campaign mixed in with some captured Union soldiers. He was taken to the brigade camp of Fitzhugh Lee, where he was interrogated by General Lee. And then he's sent up to the division headquarters, where he's once again interrogated by Jeb Stuart. Then he's sent up to Army headquarters, where he's interrogated by Robert E. Lee. The entire time he's being interrogated by these three generals, he's collecting information on them. So finally, he's going to be sent to a prisoner of war camp down in Richmond, to Libby Prison. He's sent down to Richmond. But when he gets down there, he mixes in with some Union soldiers that are being paroled, are being sent to City Point. And so he's back at Union Army headquarters within about a week of being captured, with a great deal of information on Confederate cavalry and on Lee's headquarters. But scouts, Captain John Eston Cook, who's on Stuart's staff, put up this description of scouts. It hold true for the Union side as well. Scouts had to be brave, you had to be very smart. Sometimes you had to shoot it out with the enemy, but usually you tried to slip into the enemy's camps unnoticed and tried to slip away as well. Another story about Sergeant Milton Klein, prior to the Chancellorsville campaign, he had to collect information on Confederate positions along the Rappahannock River. He met a Confederate chaplain who had to go from one end of the line to the other. He spent the entire day riding with that chaplain, collecting information while having a good, nice, convenient ride with the chaplain, then left and went back to the Union Army. But scouts were a very important source for the Union Army. And I skipped a slide here. I want to go back to this guy right here. Unfortunately for the Union Army, well, actually, fortunately and unfortunately for the Union Army, at the end of January 1863, Joe Hooker, is put in command of the Union Army, the 4th or 5th commander since the Army started, and he decides to collect all his cavalry regiments that have been separated by his predecessors into a cavalry corps. And the cavalry corps commander will eventually be this man right here, Alfred Pleasonton. I've often believed that Alfred Pleasonton's major talent was convincing his bosses that he's doing a great job when he's actually doing a terrible job. Pleasonton was a shameless self-promoter, always trying to get his name in the newspapers, and collecting information is not going to get your name in the newspapers. So he wants his horse soldiers out fighting, leading cavalry charges like that. Now, Pleasonton himself, his own men regard him as a coward, but he wants to get his name in the newspapers. He's terrible at collecting intelligence, and you're going to find that out as we go on. So, Hooker takes over the end of January in 1863. Let me get up to Joe Hooker here. And he immediately initiates a lot of series of reforms in the Union Army that does a great deal to build the morale of the Army, build the efficiency of the Army. And 2 of those reforms involve intelligence. One of them I've mentioned, which is with the cavalry, forming into a cavalry corps of about 9,000 horsemen. But his big thing, he's been having problems with the reliability of the intelligence the Army's been collecting. And so, first week of February 1863, he meets with his chief of staff, Daniel Butterfield, the Provost Marshal General of the Army of the Potomac, the Chief MP, Brigadier General Marcina Patrick, and a civilian, John Babcock, who had previously worked for the Pinkertons. Babcock is a brilliant map maker. He's a brilliant man. If you can't tell, he's a dashing-looking young man, handsome, 5'10", 27 years old. He's smart. This guy can do just about everything. You're going to hear a lot about him. And Hooker is concerned about the reliability of the information he's been collecting. He wants something better. That something better is going to be called the Bureau of Military Information, or BMI for short. The BMI was an organization that was decades ahead of its time. Nothing like it existed in the Confederate Army. Nothing like it existed in any other Union Army. Nothing like it existed in the United States Army in World War I. And despite the excellent work of the OSS and Army G2 units in World War II, nothing like it existed in World War II. It's not until the creation of the CIA in 1948 you're going to see something like the Bureau of Military Information. The BMI's only purpose was to collect and process information. When Lee gets information, all that information is coming in, he's got to sort it out himself, in addition to running his own army and planning campaigns and battles. But the BMI's got it coming into one place, and the BMI would be what is called today an all-source intelligence production agency. And what that means is they're collecting information from everywhere. From northern and southern newspapers, from captured documents in the enemy's mail. They received information over the telegraph in Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Carlisle, and Harper's Ferry. They got reports from civilian spy networks, from cavalry patrols, observation balloons, and signal stations. They interrogated prisoners, deserters, civilians, and contrabands. And information was brought in by their own excellent scouts. All that information came into one place. If you remember, about a year after 9/11, it was reported that an intelligence analyst at the FBI had uncovered the 9/11 plot. At the same time, an analyst in the CIA had uncovered the same plot. But those organizations were not talking to each other, and it was ignored. Here, all the information is coming into one place, where it's filtered, corroborated, and analyzed, verified, then combined with other intelligence for its information, and finally turned into an actual real intelligence report. One report was called an order of battle, an organizational chart of the enemy's army down to the regiment and battalion level, showing commanders, unit locations, numbers of troops, equipment, even training and morale. A few prisoners from a single regiment could reveal the arrival of a brigade of 1,600 soldiers. a division of 7,000 or even a corps of 20,000 men. Another report would describe the location of the local terrain to include river crossing points, conditions of the roads, mileage between the points, and fortifications. Still another report would come in that would give the political conditions and the state of the morale, the opposing army, their government, and the civilian population. The BMI was run by this man, Colonel George Sharp, a lawyer from Kingston, New York. Sharp had a brilliant analytical mind and developed the policies and procedures, and it's this guy that really makes all this stuff work. He's the head of the organization. John Babcock, the civilian, would come on as the Order of Battle Specialist, and Babcock already had a list of accomplishments, including one of Chicago's top architects prior to the Civil War. Captain John McKenty, also from Kingston, New York, and also a member of the 120th New York, would run missions and be sort of the branch manager at times for the BMI. He was responsible for running the BMI Scouts, which usually numbered anywhere from 10 to 30 men. And the guy sitting in the middle, the guy you should pay attention to, Sergeant Milton Klein. Milton Klein is 39 years old at the time the BMI forms in 1863. He's 10 to 15 years older than the other scouts. His son is also a scout who's 19 years old, but Klein is in charge of the scouts, and he is one of the best Union scouts you're going to find out. Running the paperwork for all this is Lieutenant Fred Manning, who is responsible for extensive and precise record-keeping of newspapers, reports, interrogations. Fred Manning also accounted for all the money, both Union and Confederate currency, which is used need by the scouts for horses, weapons, ammunition, equipment, and to bribe informants. During the Chancellorsville campaign, the BMI performed amazingly well. In March, 3 weeks after the BMI was formed, it reported on food riots in Richmond and other Confederate cities almost as soon as they happened. It knew that the Confederate soldiers' daily ration at this point was just 1 pint of flour and 4 ounces of bacon, and that the officers even lacked shoes. Just prior to the start of the Chancellorsville campaign, Hooker was receiving reports on fords and their depths, and who could cross them, bridges, road conditions, and even the schedule and load capacities of the railroads in the area. One of their agents, one of their spies, was actually the superintendent of the Richmond-Fredericksburg-Potomac Railroad that supplies Lee's army at Fredericksburg. Babcock provided an extremely accurate order of battle with 129 Confederate regiments identified. And listen to this. Sharp estimated the strength of Lee's army at the beginning of the Battle of Chancellorsville at 55,300, a number that was only off by 2%. That's amazing for an organization that's only been existed for about 6 weeks. Whatever the causes for the Union Army's defeat at Chancellorsville, none were due to intelligence failures. One concern for the BMI after Chancellorsville was the reorganization of the Confederate Army from 2 to 3 corps. There's also reorganization of several divisions and brigades, and the arrival of thousands of reinforcements from the Carolinas and the Shenandoah Valley. This meant that many Confederate troops were moving from old to new camps, which created havoc for John Babcock's order of battle. A.P. Hill's corps, being around the Fredericksburg area, was easy to identify, but became increasingly difficult to locate Lee, Longstreet, and Ewell's corps. By late May, there were rumors there would soon be some type of Confederate advance, probably a large cavalry raid from the Culpeper area into Pennsylvania. Because the Rappahannock River is strongly picketed at this point by the Confederates, little information was getting across the river. This in itself was a sign to the BMI that something big was going to happen. Furthermore, it was learned that Jeb Stuart had moved his 3 cavalry brigades 30 miles north from the good grazing ground around Orange Courthouse to Culpeper Courthouse, 30 miles north, close to the Blue Ridge Mountains in the Shenandoah Valley. With BMI scouts having difficulty getting across the river, Hooker needed his cavalry to force their way into any enemy territory to collect prisoners and get information, but that's not really happening. Alfred Pleasanton had little enthusiasm or ability for that aspect of his job and only made half-hearted attempts at reconnaissance. But still, Colonel Sharp has managed to receive some information from his scouts, Union balloons, signal stations from Union garrisons in the Shenandoah Valley. That information was enough that on May 28, Sharp would send a report to Joe Hooker with the location of the Confederate infantry divisions and where they were in the area. Now, the locations of the divisions were correct, but their numbers were off. The most important part of their report was the last two paragraphs right here, letting General Hooker know something big is about to happen. Despite his lack of initiative for reconnaissance, Pleasonton appeared to be jealous that the BMI was encroaching on the cavalry's role in information gathering. Sharp assigned John McKinty, the 6th Scouts, to travel with the cavalry. But McKinty soon complained that Pleasonton was interfering with the BMI's work by detailing his scouts to act as guides and couriers, allowing captured documents and mail to be destroyed, preventing McKinty from interrogating prisoners. By the beginning of June, it was apparent to Hooker that something was going to happen at Culpeper. But what was it? A raid or something bigger? Stuart was already there with 3 brigades of horsemen, and it was rumored that more were coming from western Virginia and North Carolina. But where were Ewell and Longstreet's infantry? On the Confederate side, Lee planned to keep A.P. Hill's corps at Fredericksburg to hold Hooker in place as long as possible. Stuart was ordered now to move his 5 cavalry brigades from Culpeper to Brandy Station, to Brandy Station, to Brandy Station, 12 miles closer to the Rappahannock River. But the other side is not aware of this yet. So Stuart moved to Brandy Station. And meanwhile, Ewell and Longstreet's corps were to pass through Culpeper behind Jeb Stuart's cavalry screen and move into the Shenandoah Valley. Ewell would be joined by Albert Jenkins' cavalry brigade in the valley. They're coming from the western part of Virginia. And then they're to advance north and capture the Union garrisons at Winchester and Martinsburg, and then move to the Rappahannock River, or rather the Potomac River. And then eventually Longstreet will follow behind him. As a final piece of counterintelligence, Stuart told his troopers they were making a large cavalry raid into Pennsylvania. The offensive was to begin on June 10th. McKinty reported to Sharp that Stuart had held a review of his troops at Brandy Station. At Brandy Station on June 5th. Unknown to anybody on the Union side, Lee had missed the review, and so Stuart held another review at Brandy Station on June 8th. At the same time, Sharp interrogated a runaway slave who claimed to be A.P. Hill's body servant. The man reported that he had heard Hill tell several officers that Lee planned an invasion of Pennsylvania through the Blue Ridge Mountains. And Joe Hooker is dissatisfied. Pleasonton keeps reporting there's no cavalry except for a single regiment at Culpeper. He's giving Hooker no information at all. And Hooker is fed up with this. He tells Pleasonton he wants him to attack Stuart and break up any planned raid and find out where Ewell and Longstreet are. Because once again, both Ewell and Longstreet have disappeared off the map. Pleasonton planned to attack Stuart at Culpeper on June 9th, unaware of, or more likely ignoring McKinty's report that Stuart had moved his horse soldiers to Brandy Station, 12 miles closer to the river. In what was the biggest cavalry battle of the entire war, both sides were caught by surprise at Brandy Station. The Union cavalry fought better than they had fought before, but Stuart held his ground. And after fighting all day, eventually the Union troopers withdrew back across the Rappahannock River. Pleasonton crowed to the newspapers how well his horse soldiers had fought, that he had broken up Stuart's planned raid. What Pleasonton didn't know was that while he was fighting at Brandy Station, 2 entire Confederate corps had passed through Culpeper undetected, only a dozen miles away. Because of the fight at Brandy Station, Stuart now needed time to refit. That would actually play into Robert E. Lee's hands, since Pleasanton now knew, finally, that Stuart was at Brandy Station. If Stuart remained at Brandy Station, Pleasanton would remain in place to watch Stuart, believing that he had broken up any Confederate cavalry raid into Pennsylvania and any of the other Confederate movements into the Shenandoah Valley. After the Civil War, Pleasanton would claim that it was his attack at Brandy Station that had uncovered Lee's plans to invade Pennsylvania. And thus, it was Pleasanton that set the Union Army on the path that would eventually lead to Gettysburg. Pleasanton uncovered nothing. What set the Union Army in motion came from a former slave, a young man named Charlie Wright. Wright had been captured with some Confederate soldiers by Union cavalry. Wright wasn't even interrogated by the soldiers that had brought him in and was let go. McKinty found Wright only by accident, working for a Union quartermaster. Wright had lived in the Culpeper area for years. He was extremely intelligent, had extremely good memory, and he was a gold mine of information for the Union Army. Wright identified more than a dozen Confederate brigades and regiments with their commanders and strengths. He told McKinty he had seen Lee, Ewell, and Longstreet in Culpeper, and that Ewell's corps had already passed through Culpeper and through Chester Gap and was now in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, Longstreet's corps was now north of Culpeper and was about to enter the valley as well. Wright had so much information that McKinty telegraphed Sharp 3 times with all this information. Unfortunately, Pleasanton's staff heard of McKinty's discovery. Before McKinty could get more information from Charlie Wright, he disappeared into a Union cavalry holding area and vanished from the pages of history, never to be heard from again, not realizing that he had set the Union Army on the path to Gettysburg. It was based on Charlie Wright's information, which McKinty quickly corroborated with other sources, that Hooker ordered his army to begin marching north on June 13th. It was Charlie Wright, not Alfred Pleasanton, that put the Army on the road to Gettysburg. Meanwhile, Union garrisons at Winchester and Martinsburg kept reporting that a large Confederate force was in the Shenandoah Valley. But Pleasanton reported on June 13th that there were no Confederates in the Shenandoah Valley. That same day, Ewell attacked both Winchester and Martinsburg. The garrison at Martinsburg escaped to Harper's Ferry, but 4,000 Union soldiers became prisoners on June 14th, along with the loss of 23 cannon, over 300 horses, and tons of supplies. 4 days later, Pleasanton will report what everybody else already knows. The Confederates have captured Winchester. By June 17th, Ewell had been moving north on the west side of the Blue Ridge Mountains for almost a week, undetected by the Union Army. Longstreet left Culpeper, was now moving into the valley, while A.P. Hill's corps at last of Fredericksburg was on its way to Culpeper. Up to this point, the Confederate Army had been moving without a cavalry screen, relying on the mountains, Pleasanton's incompetence, and luck from allowing Hooker to get little more than a glimpse of the situation. But by this time, even Pleasanton was now aware that Lee's entire army was now in the Shenandoah Valley. But now Stuart's cavalry screen was in place on the eastern side of the Blue Ridge, preventing the Union cavalry from seeing what was on the other side. On June 18th, Lee's luck continued to hold when John Mosby, whose partisan Ranger Battalion operated behind Union lines in northern Virginia, captured 2 Union staff officers carrying dispatches that gave Lee the location of the entire Union Army. By this point, Hooker was aware of Pleasanton's lax attitude towards reconnaissance. Pleasanton was ordered to cooperate with the BMI and to forward all prisoners, deserters, contrabands, documents, and mail to them. Finally, Hooker ordered Pleasanton to scout towards Winchester, Berryville, and Harper's Ferry. To ensure that his orders were understood, Hooker sent this young staff officer, Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, to deliver the orders in person. Despite an excellent record in combat and as a staff officer, numerous recommendations for promotion to major, Dahlgren was still a captain. Dahlgren was also very friendly with George Sharp and the staff of the BMI. Dahlgren was to make it clear to Pleasant what Hooker wanted from him. And so thus began a 5-day battle between two cavalries at Aldie, Middleburg, and Uppersville. But Pleasant only got a peek at Confederate infantry, and then reported without any evidence to Hooker that the Confederates were now going to Pittsburgh. Despite the improved cooperation with the cavalry, much of the information the BMI was receiving from the cavalry and other sources was inaccurate, but still things are getting better, and they are getting some information. And what the information they are providing to Hooker is very accurate. But now there's an even bigger problem. As you can see from the diary of Marcina Patrick right here, there's a problem with Joe Hooker, the Army commander. Hooker's subordinates and the leadership in Washington were losing confidence in Joe Hooker, and Joe Hooker's own mental state was becoming erratic. He seemed to be cracking up under the pressure. For Lee, everything had been going well. Despite the surprise at Brandy Station, Stuart had been very effective at screening the Army's movements, but the newspapers in the South are still harping on Brandy Station and not what Stuart is doing right now, which is good for the Confederate Army. On June 22nd, Lee's army is now on both sides of the Potomac River. Hooker was uncertain if Lee was invading Pennsylvania or going to attack Washington. The uncertainty of Lee's intentions forced Hooker to order his 7th Infantry Corps to halt, while Pleasant discovered what the Confederates were, where they were, and what they were doing. Lee, uncertain of the reason for Hooker's halt, ordered Longstreet and Hill's Corps to stop and rest before crossing Potomac. Finally, the BMI is getting a break. After 11 frustrating days, Sergeant Milton Kline and several scouts finally got through the Confederate lines. Kline discovered that Ewell had set up a transportation system to move confiscated property and supplies from Pennsylvania back to Virginia. The route ran through Greencastle, Pennsylvania. That would be important information for later use. While the cavalry was fighting, and the infantry corps of both armies were standing still, Lee decided on several deceptions. The first were included in a letter sent on June 23rd to President Jefferson Davis and the Confederate War Department. Lee wrote, with the start of the hurricane season in the Atlantic, northern newspapers were reporting there was little likelihood of any incursions along the coast of the Carolinas. Lee proposed that several brigades from the Carolinas be moved to Culpeper under General Beauregard to create a threat to Washington, D.C. A second deception requested General Samuel Jones in Western Virginia to threaten Union garrisons in his area and Western Maryland, putting those Union troops in place and creating a need for reinforcements. For his third deception, Longstreet's Corps would be the last to cross the Potomac River. However, as they were crossing the Potomac, Lee told A.P. Hill's troops to tell everybody, including reporters, they were from Longstreet's Corps, even though Longstreet was still south of the river and still a threat to Washington, D.C. Lee knew by telling reporters that and telling civilians that, the information would get into the newspapers that his entire army was now across the Potomac River and in Union territory. The final deception involved Jeb Stuart. I'm going to give you a look at these documents right here. On June 22nd, Lee sent these orders to Stuart, and the important part is in the red right here, so take a glance at that for a second. Later that day, around 7 p.m., Longstreet to write to Stuart too, with some more information. Everything seems kind of clear at this point. The next day, though, Stuart will get these orders from Lee. Now things are getting kind of muddy. But Lee does give Stuart the option of either coming back and joining the army or going and joining Ewell in Pennsylvania. On June 23rd, that same day that Lee sends Stuart these orders, John Mosby meets with Stuart and tells Stuart the Union Army was not moving at all. They're spread out across 3 counties for 25 miles. There's huge gaps between the different Union Corps that Stuart can easily pass through. Mosby tells Stuart that he can pass through Hopewell Gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains, move through the Union Army, and reach the Seneca Falls Ford on the Potomac River by the end of the day. Not only will it put Stuart ahead of the schedule to save wear and tear on the horses. Mosby tells Stuart that Mosby and his ranger will meet Stuart at Gum Springs on June 25th and guide them to the Potomac River. And June 25th is the day when everything will change. Lee fooled Joe Hooker into believing the entire Confederate Army was across the Potomac River. Because of that, Hooker starts his army moving again, and he sends orders to the Union Second Corps, which is first blocking the Hopewell Gap, bringing Stuart to get through, is to advance to the Potomac River using the Gum Springs Road, the exact place where Jeb Stuart has to meet with John Mosby. So Stuart starts moving on June 25th. Hopewell Gap is blocked. He moves a little bit farther south to Glasscock Gap. Still things are okay. He's moving towards Haymarket and towards Gum Springs when he finds Union troops in his way. Fires a couple of cannon shots to get them, moves farther to the east. Finds out his way is blocked by other Union troops. Mosby, believing that Stuart can't get through, leaves, and Stuart now rides off the map. And riding with Jeb Stuart and his cavalry is Sergeant Milton Kline. Kline will ride with Stuart and his horse soldiers for about a day, collecting information. And then he discovers a piece of the puzzle he believes is so important he decides it's time to desert from the Confederate cavalry and rides back to Union Army headquarters to report to George Sharp. On June 27th, Joe Hooker requests to relieve the command of the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln quickly accepted, and around 3 a.m. on June 28th, George Meade found out he was the new Army commander. Surprise, surprise. Hooker left in such a hurry, he left Meade with no information, no plans, not even on the location of his own army or on the location of the Confederate Army. So Dan Butterfield, George Sharp, the headquarters staff have to brief Meade to get him up to speed very quickly. While they're briefing George Meade, John Babcock, who Sharp had sent to Frederick on a dangerous mission, comes riding in the latest up-to-date information. And Meade is very impressed by what he's getting from Sharp and the BMI. Stuart's departure and the Confederate invasion of Maryland, Pennsylvania opened up the door for the BMI scouts who were sent to Hagerstown, Frederick, Greencastle, and Chambersburg. Refugees, loyal citizens, and a civilian spy network were all sending in information as well. And for once, 75% of that information coming into the BMI was extremely accurate. In fact, a spy in Chambersburg will actually report the exact number of cannons Lee's army has. That's how good it is. Sharp's also receiving at this point intelligence reports over the telegraph from 13 separate Army and government sources. Meanwhile, at 10 p.m. on June 28th, Lee learned from Longstreet scout Henry Harrison that the Union Army was now around Frederick, Maryland. Stuart's still out of the picture. The 5,000 Confederate cavalrymen Stuart had left behind with Lee are not giving Lee any information. Harrison's report was all Lee had. So Lee issues orders that will put his army on the road to Gettysburg. Information is also coming in to Sharp from a citizens group. Wrong one. By a local citizens here, David McConaughey, who runs a spy network here. And McConaughey's information to Sharp, which Sharp is now at Taneytown, Maryland, is extremely accurate. McConaughey will tell Sharp on June 29th that Jubal Early's division already passed through Gettysburg on the 26th, headed towards York. Gordon's division, actually Ed Johnston's Stonewall division, is at Shippensburg. A.P. Hill is approaching Fayetteville, and Longstreet is encamped at Chambersburg. And on the 29th, George Sharp would send this note to David McConaughey. I don't know if Sharp ever met McConaughey after the battle was over. I kind of hope that he did. But this letter would later appear in Gettysburg newspapers after the war was over. McConaughey's reports to Sharp were extremely accurate, and they're going straight from Sharp straight to John Buford. George Sharp's biographer, Peter Saris, wrote, "It would be McConaughey's reports, more than any other source, would send Buford and his division to Gettysburg." Buford himself was now sending a constant flow of up-to-date reports back to John Reynolds and to Army headquarters. On June 23rd at 11 a.m., John Buford's cavalry division rode into Gettysburg. Buford learned, probably from McConaughey, that Hill's corps was now at Cashtown, with Longstreet behind him around between Chambersburg and Fayetteville. Ewell was coming from Carlisle and York. Buford immediately sent out patrols in every direction. One of them captured a Confederate courier that placed Robert E. Lee at Chambersburg. Later that night on the 30th, Buford sent out 2 dispatches to Reynolds, who was now at Mord's Tavern near Marsh Creek, and Army headquarters now at Taneytown. The dispatches put Hill to the west of Cashtown, with Longstreet several miles behind Hill. Ewell, with Rhodes' division, was now at Petersburg, which is now Biglerville, while Jubal Early was between Berlin and Hanover. Babcock and McGinty were now with Reynolds and would have provided additional information as well. All indications were that the Confederate Army was now headed towards Gettysburg. Why do I keep doing that wrong button there? From the cupola of the Lutheran Seminary on July 1st at 7 a.m., Lieutenant Aaron Jerome, the signal officer with Buford's division, looking through his binoculars, saw skirmishers from Heath's division advancing on either side of the Chambersburg pike. He alerted General Buford and then sent a message to Reynolds to the signal station at Emmitsburg. This is 30 minutes before the first shot is fired. Wadsworth's division of the 1st Corps arrived around 10 a.m. Although Reynolds was killed, Union counterattacks at Herbst Woods, the railroad cut, took hundreds of prisoners, which were quickly sent to Babcock and McGinty for interrogation. At 11:30, Jerome spotted Rhodes' division coming down from the north on the Carlisle Road and forwarded that information to Oliver Howard, who ordered the 11th Corps to the north of town. Twice that morning already, Jerome had sent real-time intelligence reports to commanders on the field to allow them to anticipate Confederate advances. Jerome moved his signal station to the Adams County Courthouse, where he tried to warn of Early's advance down the Harrisburg Road, but it was too late. A new signal station with Jerome would retreat into town. A new signal station would be established on East Cemetery Hill near Stevens Knoll. Another will be established on West Cemetery Hill, about where the Speaker's rostrum is for the National Cemetery today. Another signal station is about 150 to 200 yards from where you're sitting right now over here. Another signal station will be on Powers Hill, and one at Little Round Top. There'll be another one out behind the Confederate lines over in Fairfield on Jack's Mountain. That one will be captured on July 6th. And signal stations at Emmitsburg, Maryland, and Taneytown. And from Taneytown, it's just a 10-mile ride to the telegraph station at Emmitsburg, Maryland. At Westminster, Maryland, rather. When word reached Meade of Reynolds' death, Hancock's 2nd Corps was at Taneytown with Meade. Now Meade's map showed terrain features, and he didn't know the ground where he might have to fight a battle, or the condition of the 2 Union Corps that were there. If he leaves and goes to Gettysburg, he'll be caught up possibly in a retreat and be isolated from the rest of his army. At Taneytown, he's centrally located. But Hancock is close by, and he trusts Hancock. She sends Hancock to Gettysburg and tells him what he wants to know. Meade received Hancock's report around 6 p.m., and Sharp was there to write his impressions of it. A little bit later, Sharp, with the rest of the BMI staff and the Army headquarters, rejoined Babcock McGinty at Gettysburg. 600 Confederate prisoners had been taken on July 1st, and Babcock and McGinty had been busy interrogating prisoners and filling in the order of battle chart. Throughout the day on July 2nd, Sharp, as one of the Army's senior officers, staff officers rather, helped Meade fight the battle on July 2nd by delivering verbal orders, providing guidance to commanders on the field. Sharp was confident that Babcock, McKinty, and the BMI staff could operate without him, and they could. I mentioned earlier that Sergeant Milton Kline had slipped in with Jeb Stuart's cavalry on June 25th. When Kline reached Taneytown, he told Sharp he had learned the schedule of Confederate couriers running from Richmond to Lee's army, that a courier from Richmond would be passing through Greencastle on July 2nd. Apparently, either Sharp or Kline mentioned the Confederate courier to Ulrich Dahlgren, because Dahlgren volunteered to take Sergeant Kline, 4 scouts, and 10 cavalrymen to intercept the courier. Dahlgren and his team left Taneytown on June 30th, dressed in civilian clothes. Dodging Confederate patrols, they made their way to Waynesboro, where Dahlgren learned of the fighting at Gettysburg. Dahlgren and his men met 2 recently discharged Union soldiers who agreed to guide them the rest of the way to Greencastle. They arrived in Greencastle on the morning of July 2nd and changed into their uniforms. Dahlgren climbed up to the belfry of the Dutch Reformed Church in the center of town and spotted the Confederate courier and his escort riding towards this town from the south. Turning north, he saw Confederate wagon train, also with an escort marching to the town from that direction. Confederates greatly outnumbered Dahlgren's men. Dahlgren told his men of the importance of the Confederate courier. And he asked them, how should we take them? With pistols or sabers? And his men drew their sabers and they said, with this. It was decided they would wait until the 2 enemy columns reached the center of town and then charge them. That's exactly what they did. Confederates panicked and fled, allowing Dahlgren and his men to take 17 prisoners, including the courier. Digging through the courier's mailbags, Dahlgren could find nothing of importance until he noticed the courier looking nervously at his saddle. Dahlgren removed the saddle and found what he was looking for. He told Kline to take charge of the prisoners because he needed to ride as fast as he could the 30 miles to Gettysburg with the documents and get him to Meade's headquarters. Meanwhile, back here at Gettysburg, it's been a hard day for the Union Army and for the Confederate Army, and Meade and his staff are returning to the Army headquarters at the Leister House. And Sharp would write this account later after the war. A servant had brought in an almost empty bottle of whiskey, a little bacon, some cherries, and hardtack crackers, and placed the food on the table in the house. Nobody drank the whiskey because there was only enough for one drink, even though Meade kept encouraging him to drink the whiskey. Meade himself asked for a cup of coffee and encouraged the staff to eat. Because there was so little food, neither Meade nor Sharp ate anything, although neither man had had anything to eat since leaving Taneytown almost 24 hours earlier, the previous night. Meade wanted his senior generals to report to the Leister House, so everybody left to deliver Meade's message. Only Colonel Sharp remained with Meade. Meade told Sharp, I must have more detailed information, the strength of the enemy. Can you get reliable information of the number of troops engaged today, and whether he has any fresh troops in reserve? Can you also get the numbers of one of our own corps, which is expected? Here he's talking about the 6th Corps, which is marching 32 miles to get to the battlefield. Sharp left to talk to John Babcock to find out what the BMI had discovered. When Sharp returned, he found that only Generals Hancock and General Slocum were present with Meade at the Leister House, and Slocum was asleep on the bed. Hancock was sitting at the end of the bed. Sharp comes in and he sees that the bottle of whiskey is still on the table along with 2 hardtack crackers. And he read from Babcock's report to Meade and the generals. Prisoners have been taken today and last evening from every brigade in Lee's army, excepting the 4 brigades of Pickett's division. Every division has been represented except Pickett's, from which we have not a single prisoner. They are from nearly 100 different regiments. All of the Confederate troops have been in action except Pickett's division and a small body of cavalry. Pickett's division has arrived. Our own troops have come up who are now in bivouac will be ready to go into action fresh tomorrow morning. Sharp went through how Babcock had arrived at his estimates. They knew that Pickett had 5 brigades, but one of those brigades was still in the Richmond area. There was one brigade the BMI had not discovered, and that was Junius Daniels' North Carolina Brigade and Robert Rhodes' division. And that's because he had only recently joined Rhodes' division. It was new to the Army of Northern Virginia, and no prisoners had come in, no prisoners or deserters had come in from that brigade on July 1st, July 2nd. But otherwise, it was a completely accurate assessment of Lee's army, except for one final piece of the puzzle that would soon come in. As soon as Sharp finished reading the report, Hancock jumped up from the bed and yelled loud enough to wake Slocum, "General, we have got them nicked." And Sharp thought it was unusual that Hancock used the word nicked instead of licked. And Sharp later told Babcock that when Meade heard Babcock's report, he said, "By God, I'll stay here." And that's an eyewitness. Meade's already made the decision to stay here and fight. There's no guessing about this later on. Meade had already made the decision. But now, the 4 tired, hungry men were silent, and Sharp noticed they were all looking down at the table. The 2 crackers and a bottle with only 1 drink in it. And he suddenly realized the reason why the hardtack was still there is because the generals couldn't figure out how to divide the hardtack into 3 pieces. And Hancock looked up and turned to Meade and said, "General Meade, don't you think Sharp deserves a cracker and a drink?" So Sharp will leave with his reward of hardtack and a bottle of whiskey. Sometime before 9 p.m., Meade will send a staff officer riding 30 miles to Westminster with this message for the War Department in Washington, D.C. And once again, you can see before Meade has met with his generals, he's already decided he's going to stay here. So there's documentation, right, that there's no doubts about whether Lee's going to stay here or not. Sometime after 9 p.m., Meade meets with his generals. He reports they've suffered heavy casualties and need rations. But the morale of the army was strong. Butterfield thought the generals should vote whether to stay here at Gettysburg. Meade doesn't need their vote. He's already made the decision. But he does need to ensure that he's reading the situation correctly. He's been awake at this point for 24 hours. He's exhausted. Is he understanding the situation correctly? And the generals will vote. Previous commanders of the Army of the Potomac had kept their subordinates in the dark. Not so with George Meade. He wanted everybody to know. He wanted to know what his generals thought. And after the problems of July 2nd, he wanted to ensure that everybody was on the same sheet of music. By allowing the generals to vote whether to stay and fight it out, they now all own part of the decision. And now the last piece of the puzzle arrived. Probably shortly after the meeting ended, Captain Dahlgren rode in to deliver the captured documents to George Meade. The documents were letters addressed to General Lee from General Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General of the Confederate Army down in Richmond, and from President Jefferson Davis. Cooper's letter told Lee that because of the threat from Union troops at Yorktown and Fort Monroe, Pickett's 2 brigades would remain in the Richmond area, and no further reinforcements would be coming to Lee's army. Ironically, Cooper also suggested Lee should spare some of his own troops to protect his lines of communication against attempted raids by the enemy. Oops. Davis's letter, dated June 28th, filled in an even bigger picture. Davis wrote he'd been unaware of Lee's diversionary plan to create a small army under General Beauregard at Culpeper until he received Lee's June 23rd letter. Davis told Lee that his suggestion was impossible, that there were simply no troops available for that purpose. Davis then outlined every Union threat from the eastern seaboard to the Mississippi River, telling Lee where and how many Confederate troops there were to oppose those threats. He informed Lee there were no troops to pull from anywhere. Davis's letter would provide the War Department in Washington with the strategic intelligence to understand the overall situation in the Confederacy, while Cooper's letter to Meade provided Meade with the operational intelligence that there were no reinforcements in the region coming to Lee's army and that there were no other threats to Washington, D.C. Finally, Sharp provided Meade with the tactical intelligence to fight the next day's battle. Meade now had his 70% of the pieces of the puzzle. On the other side of the field, Robert E. Lee doesn't have enough pieces and only has an unclear picture of the Union Army. He has an underfounded belief that they are demoralized and ready to break. And the next day will lead to victory. And the rest, as they say, is history. Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, who had waited months for promotion to major, was immediately jumped 3 ranks to full colonel. Unfortunately for Colonel Dahlgren, he was killed on March 2, 1864 in a cavalry raid on Richmond, which is still shrouded in mystery and controversy even today. Sharp, Babcock, and McKinty would continue to fight the information war to the end. After the war, all 3 would live long and successful lives, except for a few brief newspaper articles and speeches after the war, which gave away nothing. None of them ever spoke or wrote about their work with the BMI, believing that even after the war, there were people and secrets that still needed to be protected. They would take those secrets with them to the grave. The records of the Bureau of Military Information would be buried in the National Archives, still wrapped in their original red tape, unseen for almost a century. However, for the rest of their lives, these 3 men, George Sharp, John Babcock, and John McKinty, understood what they had done here at Gettysburg and the part they had played and would play in winning the war. They believed there was the information where they fought with the intelligence they provided throughout the campaign, but especially on the night of July 2nd, 1863, that made the difference between victory and defeat here at Gettysburg. The end. I want to thank you for coming. If you want to read further on the intelligence war, the guy that uncovered the BMI's records in the National Archives was William Edwin Fishel. And he discovered those records still wrapped up in the red tape and filled it in a half of a room of the National Archives. And he discovered them in October 1959. For 30 years, he would mine those records. In 1996, he would publish this book, The Secret War for the Union, which gives a good account of intelligence operations from the beginning of the war all the way up through Gettysburg. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure he planned to write a second book. Fishel would die 2 years after this book was published, so he never got around to writing the second book. In the early 2000s, and Sharp had been an intelligence analyst working for the NSA. Another intelligence analyst working for the Defense Intelligence Agency, Thomas Wright, had written several accounts, actually 5 different articles, I think, for Gettysburg Magazine in the early 2000s. In 2015, he would publish this book, Spy, Scouts, and the Secrets of the Gettysburg Campaign. It's an excellent, good book. I talked to Ryan a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about this third book here, which is a biography of George Sharp, written by Peter Sars, who is also an intelligence analyst. Sharp had an incredible life, did great work during the Civil War, after the Civil War. After the war is over, he's sent by the War Department to pursue Lincoln conspirators in Europe. Comes back, becomes a kingpin of New York politics. Close friend of U.S. Grant. They even went on vacation together. Close friend of President Jefferson, President Chester Arthur, was from former Confederates after the war, met with him in his hometown of Kingston after the war, was the very popular Speaker of the House of Delegates of New York. Even his own political opponents said Sharp was a honest and forthright and generous man. He lived a fantastic life. This book, Ryan told me, this is the book he wished he had written, and it's a fantastic book. Just the 2 chapters alone on Gettysburg are worth the price of the book. Then finally, actually I used 22 sources for this program, but the last book I'll also recommend, this just recently came out last year by Douglas Miller, who writes on intelligence stories for Newsweek and Time, Lincoln Spies, and this is more for the general public. It's a easier, lighter reading. It's got more on spy stories, and especially on the private detective agencies during the war, but it is a pretty good book. If you have any questions, though, I'll stick around. Thank you for coming. Next week, Saturday, I believe, is Tom Holbrook with Secrets of Our all the junk we have downstairs here. And Sunday is Chris Gwynn, the boss, talking about Culp, Sill, History and Memory. Should be a good program. Well, thank you for coming. If you have any questions, I'll stick around. But thank you for coming to Gettysburg today and this program. Thanks. Oh, 5 minutes over. I'm sorry.